Hey, it's Sonia, and welcome to the Marta podcast.
Often people don't know their purpose. Sometimes they don't yet truly even know themselves. They want success, but more than that, they want joyful lives with deeper meaning. In today's podcast, I am beyond excited to sit down and chat with Nathan Andres, which is described by Katrina Wright as having an astounding passion and energy for personal growth. And in my opinion, that has completely transferred across the episode. Without a doubt, every single word that I said about his book, Your Real Life, which I have over here, is true. I suggest that you go ahead and share this podcast with anyone that's interested in personal growth or is interested in getting to know their real self. I thought, what best than to start in itself with giving you a heads up about what the real model is and why it's such a great framework that you should follow. So it starts off with reality, which is the first step in getting real. And it requires you to face the truth, what you're currently challenged with, and forces you to understand how you typically respond to adversity and prepare yourself to change your habits. Then it moves on to energy, which is the second step. And it's all about understanding and managing your energy. And there's this amazing quote here from the introduction that says, once you understand energy regulation, how to recover energy, and where to focus it, you will be able to respond instead of react to adversity by harnessing and allocating resources more wisely. And then he moves on to the third step, which is authenticity. And he mentions these three things: that it's important to learn, identify, and nurture your authentic self, because without true authenticity, you'll never be able to bounce beyond adversity. And then moving on to the fourth and final step in getting real is love, which encourages us to love wholly and completely. And it helps you build that resilience because it makes you stronger and healthier. So without further ado, let's find out with this real model here as a vehicle of you to start finally tackling your real life, to see what Nathan has been getting up to before writing this book. Nathan Andres is a globally recognized coach, well-being advocate, and LGBTQ activist with over 2 decades of experience in human resources and leadership development. His passion for helping people thrive both personally and professionally has shaped his career, making him a sought-after expert in career reinvention, authenticity, and resilience. Nathan's journey has taken him across the world, from his roots in Columbus, Ohio, to living and working in Asia Pacific for nearly 20 years. He's a 4-time marathon finisher, a dedicated advocate for well-being, and a firm believer in lifelong learning. His impressive background includes a master's in coaching, learning, and development from Middlesex University, and he's a certified executive coach through the International Coaching Federation. Currently splitting his time between Washington, D.C. and Singapore, Nathan continues to empower individuals and organizations, helping them navigate transformation and unlock their full potential. Whether through coaching, speaking engagements, or his advocacy work, Nathan's mission is clear: to guide others toward authenticity and fulfillment in all aspects of life. He's the author of Your Real Life, Get Authentic, Be Resilient, and Make It Count. And today we're going to show you how to do just that. Nathan Andres, welcome to the Marta podcast. It's an absolute delight to have you on here.
Hey, Sonia. It's good to be here too. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Listen, I've already showed you before the recording how I've completely annotated your book. I love it. And I want to say it again so the listeners can go ahead and listen it from my part as well. It was a complete life changer, from all of the research that you've included and all of the strategies and how you started off very on a broad level and then deepened into a lot of information and practical advice. And then with the key takeaways at the end of every chapter, it's so accessible and it makes your real life and your dream life absolutely one step away from reading this book. And I completely look forward to having today's conversation. So here's where I want to take you first. Your journey has really taken you all over the world, from corporate leadership to coaching and activism. Could we start with you talking directly to the person listening right now? And from all your expertise in coaching, well-being, and your love of helping people, what you're about to share in today's episode, what would the 3 biggest takeaways be for the listener?
Yeah, fantastic. I think the first is you're going to learn about the book, and the book is your real life. And we're going to talk more specifically about what that is. But you're going to learn specifically, what do authentically resilient people do to live a life of well-being and joy? And there's a secret to that, and that's all in the book. We're going to get into that. The second thing you're going to learn is about how to lead your life with love. And this is really a powerful way of thinking and a mindset and a way of being. And I think the third thing is you're going to hear some just fun stories about how everyday adversity, because I felt like you can't write a book about resilience without talking about adversity. Because adversity and change are much of the causes of our challenges. And actually, change is also part of the solution. So you're going to hopefully hear some fun stories about adversity and how you can easily get through life's little things and big things in order to live that life of well-being and joy.
Absolutely. I love those two. And I love how also you start by talking actually about authenticity and about adversity, because that's actually where resilience comes from, as you talk about in your book. And the biggest game changer for me is the acronym of your real life: reality, energy, authenticity, and love. Now, could you talk to me, and here's a little challenge I'm going to throw at you, for 1 minute as to why you could persuade the reader to get their hands on this book and why you think it's so impactful to have it up on their shelf.
Yeah, you know what? I hope it's okay to say a bad word here, but shit happens, okay?
It happens.
Shit happens. Sonia nodded her head and she said, yeah, you can say a bad word. Shit
Yeah.
happens. And every day we're stepping in all kinds of things. And so the intent of the book, and as you showed me in the green room while we were waiting to get started here, the book is meant to be a field guide. It is meant to be marked up and earmarked and dog-eared and, notes and highlighted. It's a field guide. The whole intent was, people kept asking me, like, Nathan, how have you lived through such crazy things like 9/11 and hurricanes and typhoons and tsunami, earthquake disasters? And how you run marathons, and how do you get through these hard things? And yesterday, to be honest, Sonia, we were talking, and so your audience, yesterday I lost my dear dog from a really sudden illness. And so, like, life's adversities, they stack up really quickly. And so the book is really about enabling people who pick it up to use it as that field guide and reference to get through life's hard stuff. And it's jam-packed, filled with tips, tricks, and also what I say, that the core components, those 4 key anchors that resilient people do in order to become resilient and more resilient, but also to live a life of well-being and joy. And that's facing reality, managing energy, breathing life into their authentic selves, and leading their life with love. And we're going to talk about that.
Absolutely. So from what you've just given me as a head start there, we've touched upon the blueprint, the framework of your real life. Could you go ahead and talk to me briefly about each one of these sections and why, as you mentioned, managing your energy is so important, but not only redirecting it, but also harnessing it and using love and having an intense pleasure for what you do when in your work life, so passion meets purpose and you stick to it.
Yeah, the real anchors of the book are what I found in not only my own life, but in the research, are the same anchors that you can use to get to life, a life of well-being and joy. So the first anchor really is about reality. And I talk about reality and facing reality. If you're going to go through something hard, you've got to face reality. And in fact, this is probably the biggest step. And in the book, I talk about what I call the reality curve. When you step in that shit and you lean into that, the first thing you have to do is acknowledge that you've just stepped in poop, like you've just stepped in something horrible. Something bad has happened. There's an obstacle or there's an event that happens, sometimes man-made, sometimes self-created, sometimes Mother Nature. Adversity comes in all shapes and sizes. And I also talk about the intersectionality of problems, and intersectionality of adversity stacks up. So the first step of reality is really about acknowledging that something has happened. What happens next is that you slide down this curve. I call it the reality curve. You slide down in the slope of suffering as you're trying to figure out what just happened. And then there's denial and anger and frustration and fear or sadness or all of the emotional things that lead us to spiral down. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, I think. But you have to get, when you're facing reality, you've got to get to accept. When we accept that something bad has happened, or that there's been an adverse moment or an event or obstacle that's suddenly introduced itself to ourselves, when we accept it, we're able to start to move up the curve. And it's when we move up that curve that we meet advertenity. Advertenity is the collision of opportunity and adversity. If they had a baby, it would look like advertenity. And when we look for advertenity, which is looking at the bright spots in dark moments, and we use a growth mindset, we're able to kind of even further climb and find courage and hope. And it's through courage and hope, as you accelerate up, you're able to build an action plan. The action plan gets you back to the top of the curve. But the idea is that you've learned something along the way. And I think so when we talk about resilience, and starting with reality is a great place, is resilience is two-part definition. Resilience, and resilient people do the four things in the book, but resilience is really about, firstly, taking control back from the adversity. Okay. And the second part is the growth and using the learning that comes from taking that control back. So as you think about that J curve and the reality curve, you're gaining resilience when you move from acknowledge to accept. And when you're moving up the curve again, you're taking control back, but you're also using the learning of previous adversities. That leads us really nicely to energy. And you talked already about like the power of energy. We don't talk enough about energy. Energy is always the thing that is creating our ability to breathe life into that action plan. It's the thing that enables us to recognize and acknowledge and accept that something bad has happened. And it's through energy and harnessing it that we get to be really familiar with and how we charge it up and how things can drain us. And so I talk a lot about how energy, which is the second anchor in the book, can be a real important dynamic to building resilience. And resilient people know really clearly how to manage their energy, and they know what charges them up and they know what drains them. The third anchor is authenticity. And this is really about getting to know who you are from the inside out and the outside in. And I call this the deep work. I do a lot of deep work with my coaching clients, do a lot of deep work with young people who are figuring out what their career is going to be. I do a lot of work actually with people who are starting in their careers, and also mid-career people who are trying to figure out what am I supposed to be doing? What am I here for? What's my purpose? What's the mission of my life? How do I create meaningful work for myself? Well, I tell you what, it starts from within. You have to understand what drives you, what your values are, what your beliefs are, core strengths, and then use those to your greatest advantage to create a purpose-driven life and a purpose statement that enables you to create a guiding star for the things that you say yes to in your life and your career and the work, and also the things that you say no to. And when you are crystal clear on that part of your life and you know exactly what you're meant to be doing, it brings a clarity in the ways that you might not have experienced before. You say, no, I'm not doing that, because that is not in service of any of the things that I'm meant to do. Or you see in your career, or you see a job opportunity, yeah, I'm doing that because that's fully aligned to not only who I am on the inside, but it also matches like my skills and my strengths and how I know I can contribute and make a difference. And that leads us to the last part of the fourth anchor, which is love. And when you love yourself and you know exactly who you are and you've done that deep work, you've pulled out all the things from the inside and pushed them into the world on the outside and validated them on the outside world and gone out and lived and visited your values and your strengths in action in life and learn from adversity, taking back control and experience that. You pull that back in, that inside outside life. enables you to love all the things about yourself. And there's a big difference, knowing things about yourself and being yourself, two different things. When you live your life with knowing exactly who you are from the inside out and the outside in, you're much more able then to forgive yourself, which I talk about as one of the core tenets. You're able to forgive others, but you also use language that it communicates love and understanding how you want to create the atmosphere for yourself to live a loving life and a joyful life. Words matter. And we talk about that a lot in the book. Is your story telling you, or are you telling your story? It's really about how you use language, but importantly, how you build community. And going through hard things, adversity is always done better when we do things together. And I show some great examples and stories about how that can come together for you. But last and not least, hopefully you get a sense that sense of humor is part of who I am. I can't take ourselves too seriously, but humor and the science of humor, and you mentioned there's a lot of science in the book, but please, listeners, don't worry. It's not overly scientific. I've tried to make it really accessible, but the science of humor actually drives not only how we love and love ourselves, but can be a real important part of enabling resilience, and an authentic resilience that enables us to really use all the things that are unique about ourselves to go through all the things that are uniquely hard and challenging for ourselves at the same time. So that's an overview of the real model. And when we talk about getting real, keep it real, let's get real, that's what I'm talking about. And so it works in a way that makes it fun, but it's also really, really useful.
I feel so proud that I just went ahead and read this book before our call today, because I would have not been such a changed person if I wouldn't have gone ahead and done that. And you've unpacked really all of the essence that the book has to offer. And it's a lot to take in. So I want to take you step by step for the people that haven't yet
read the book,
already read the book, to what this blueprint really entails off. So let's start with reality, facing the truth of life. You've talked about how it takes you through accepting, parts in your life which can include suffering or impermanence, and really growing and progressing through life's hardships. Something that I really like is how you say that when you were experiencing suffering, if you can think of something in a different way or introduce a new concept, it can help you think that through adversity differently and build a more flexible brain. But it's not easy to do. And here I want to guide you into the fact that many people already struggle with accepting hard truths and what's known as the imposter syndrome, as you mentioned in your book, and negative self-talk. How can they begin to develop a mindset that embraces these rather than resisting the realities that they come with?
Yeah, I think that's such a big question, Sonia.
I'm already setting you up on here on the pedestal.
Yeah, it's a big question. And we can talk specifically about self-sabotage and negative self-talk. The brain is wired in some really specific ways. And there's some neuroscience in the book that we talk about. And we can get there in a second. But I think the point that you're firstly addressing is what I call painful truths. There are some painful truths that we have to face when we step in shit. And some of that is that we don't like hitting those obstacles. And our brains are often wired for keeping us safe. And so when we have a negativity bias, in the brain, and it goes back to when we were a very early species and we were, surviving in a world that's really different than the one we live in today. But our brains are wired to monitor for threats, and this negativity bias is constantly scanning for threats. And what am I going to do with this? And how am I going to handle this? And where am I going to eat? And how do I find food? And how do I protect the other people in my group? Am I going to get eaten by a lion? These kinds of instinctual moments that our predecessors and prehistoric ancestors had to face. So this unfortunate element is still hardwired in our brain. And so when hard things happen to us, we automatically think of the negative thing because we're trying to protect ourselves. And so what actually seems like a hard thing or a painful truth is coming from our brain chemistry, but also is coming from our experiences of how we've evolved as a species, but also in the modern era, our brains have not caught up to how we detect such threats. Such threats come in the form of, over influencers on Instagram, and how those
Yeah.
make us feel. Our brain has not caught up in the advances of how to manage that. So there's a painful truth in saying, well, actually, I live in this world, a modern world, but my brain is still, in this very primitive state. How do I make sure that I bring awareness to that? And so we talk a lot about bringing awareness in the book through a variety of different ways so that you can get to know yourself. So that when you have a painful truth or a hard truth, which is, I don't like this thing, recognize it's your brain saying, actually, you don't like it because it might make you feel insecure, or it might make you feel uncomfortable. It might make you feel judged. And so recognizing those moments are also a pivot point of then taking back control. Okay, which is that definition of resilience. I'm going to not allow that painful truth to exist so hard. I'm going to take back the narrative and I'm going to turn that into something powerful for myself. And that's where Advertenity comes in, and building that Advertenity mindset is looking for a little bit of light in the painful truth or the hard truth. And it is a cycle that you have to train yourself to do, but it's not hard once you recognize that your brain automatically defaults to this negativity bias. And by the way, that's where self-sabotage comes from. That's where your inner critic comes from. That's where all of this imposter syndrome was born, is in this place in our brains, in the amygdala, to perceive threats and to take care of us. And so it can really be something that you develop. And resilience, we're born with some of it. You can develop more of it. And it's more times you learn how to take back control from hard things, the better you get at it. So that's an introduction. I know you wanted to talk about specific things along the way, but I think understanding that a big part of building resilience and also building a sense of your authentic self comes from building awareness, self-awareness, and recognizing the times and the tools and a little bit of the brain science to know what's going on in your body.
Yeah, and I mean, I love that you mentioned Advertenity, because my mom specifically is all crazy about this term. She loves it and she implements it every day. And it's because when I first saw it in the book, I instantly thought of her. And now hearing you say it and place such an emphasis on it makes me want to repeat what it means, is seeing adversity as an opportunity. And it's a game full of words, plays onto the two. And you have this formula about growth and optimism leading to Advertenity and the Advertenity mindset. Could you share a specific example of how the shift in perspective specifically for you has transformed your life in terms of someone that you've already coached?
Wow. To be honest, I was thinking about my current Advertenity, which is losing my dog yesterday. But the question is really about clients who have embraced the Advertenity mindset and seeing moments of clarity. I think this happens a lot for early career people. I know that's a big part of the audience listening today. It happens, by the way, to mid-career people and also folks in the senior C-suite. Which is, you get this issue at work, and there's actually a really good example in the book, and I'm thinking of another one from a client I'm coaching at the moment. And out of confidentiality, I'm not going to name names or be too specific. That's a big part of the confidentiality agreement that we make as coaches with our clients. But I can tell the audience here that often there's something that happens at work, and it might be a redundancy, or that you think you've not performed very well, or you got the performance evaluation back, and that's kind of the specific thing here. The performance evaluation came back and it wasn't what you hoped. You think that you've done a great job. You think that you've been an amazing performer and a superstar, and that you should be on the highfalutin talent roster of future stars. And the performance evaluation comes back with some really critical feedback. And that's a painful truth, right?
Yeah.
It's like, well, wait a minute. My performance isn't as good as I thought. And what happens oftentimes, and with the two cases I'm thinking about, is in the coaching, we say, well, what do you want to do with that? And what are the key ingredients of that feedback that you received that said that you weren't performing? What can you take back in your own control? And how do you see that in a different way? Specifically, one example was the person was thinking that they had always been giving great ideas in the room and on the team and saying, well, here's what we can do. Here's what we can do. We should do this. We should do this. It was, this is the way. And there was a lack of collaboration. And the feedback was, you don't collaborate well, you overtalk, and you are suffocating people in the room from enabling the group to do what it needs to do. That's pretty specific feedback, right? And that's a painful truth. Like if if you can't help yourself, you know, and you got the Riz and you're like, hey, I got to get out there and share my stuff, and I got all the ideas, you know, and it's like I want to be out there being a leader early on, and people are saying, well, tone it down. Well, then the advertenity mindset is what? The advertenity mindset says, all right, I can grow from that. And if I think about how do I optimistically reframe, and reframing is a big part of building awareness, how do I reframe collaboration or my ideas or communicating or sharing out that information so that I'm not being perceived as, you know, over talkative or a bit bullish, you know, with my ideas? How do I use my skill in communicating to invite more people in? How do I have the idea in the back of my mind and still then enable others to kind of have their ideas on the table and throw mine in, and then we talk about that? That's growth and optimism. Advertenity, right, is seeing, all right, but what happens is a lot of times people take that feedback, let's get back onto the reality curve. They take the feedback and they acknowledge, but they can't accept it. And they can't accept the feedback because suddenly they think that they are a bull a big bully on the team, and that their ideas are never listened to. And suddenly there's this sense of, well, I'm not good enough because I thought I was great and I've got all these ideas, but now I'm being told to be quiet. That can really change the dynamic. What you do is when you think about that debilitating of maybe I'm not good enough and that feedback wasn't right, and now I'm perceived as a bully and none of my ideas are going to be accepted and I'm being told to be quiet, thinking about it in a negative way and with a limited mindset versus a growth mindset, you're not going to go in the places that you want to go. And so for this client, the unlock was really about seeing the bright side of the feedback around collaboration and communication and ideation and creation. Is not about how, you know, you're getting shut down, because that's a spiral down, right? Say, oh, they don't appreciate me. I don't want to work here anymore. I'm really pissed off now because, you know, they didn't see that I have all this, you know, flavor. It's actually, no, I actually need to reharness and shift the way I am showing up and how I use my strength of communication and how I use the ability to give ideas and collaborate in a different way. And that was a huge unlock for this client. And it's a pattern. It may not be exactly that for all my clients, but the cases that I'm thinking about are like this.
Can I take you back to the different types of adversity that I've read about in the beginning of the book? Because it was a very interesting call to reality to see that there's actually 7 different types of adversity, 3 in specific being external. And now if you've got the book in front of you, which I perhaps think what you're doing is, this is page 31. And I'm talking specifically about the 3 external ones: the social, the environmental, and the financial adversities that we encounter. And this can have an impact on how we tackle life, because you talk about learned helplessness and learned optimism. And I remember off the top of my head now that there was a study at the Virginia University that 70% of the, let's say, learned resilience actually comes from how we live our own lives, the experiences that we go through and how we are raised, especially as we're growing up. How can a person shift from feeling stuck in those difficult circumstances, whether they're being affected by social, challenging, difficult times, or financial adversities, to take control and finding growth?
Yeah, the 3 that are external that you referred to, kind of social, environmental, and financial, you know, these are things that are often happening around us. We mentioned one before around kind of like the social influencing and Instagram, social media, but this is also, how you might encounter relationship issues with your friends or with your neighbors or social problems that kind of show up in workplaces. So we're not immune. Environmental is surely the things related to climate in the most obvious ways and kind of our environment where we live and our houses and things, but it's also
I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor for this episode, Computer Generated Solutions. If you're looking to take your career to the next level, CGS is the place to be. With almost 8,000 employees worldwide, CGS is a global leader offering exciting career opportunities in technology, customer service, and business solutions. They invest in professional growth, providing continuous skill development in an international work environment. If you're ready to grow your career and explore opportunities at CGS today, find out more details at www.romania.cgsinc.com.
environmental is surely the things related to climate in the most obvious ways and kind of our environment where we live and our houses and things. But it's also environment is really about the atmospheres that we put ourselves in workplaces and with friendship circles and so forth. Financial adversity are those that are related to, how we think about money and how we plan for money. And there's a whole world of financial coaches out there helping people and coaching people through financial decision making. But the adversities of financial impacts show up. I think the question that you're trying to get to is, how when we think about enabling resilience in these spaces and using a mindset to avoid learned helplessness is really about, again, I'm going to probably sound like I'm repeating myself, is about being aware of what's happening in our bodies when you encounter these types of adversities. If your body is saying freeze or crap, I've run out of money, what am I going to do? And a lot of people run down at the spiral of helplessness. And you mentioned learned helplessness. We can learn to be helpless. Learned helplessness was kind of discovered and built. A whole science, positive psychology, is built on this. Some of these working theories by Dr. Martin Seligman, who is the fourth founder of this area of psychology. But we can learn to be helpless, and the more times that we become helpless and say, "Well, I'm not going to help myself. My financial problems they're so terrible. I don't know what I'm going to do. And it's therefore I stop working, and therefore I get worse and worse. And I spiral down into what is called hopelessness. And the hopelessness and the helplessness feed each other. More hopelessness drives more learned helplessness. And the more you learn to be helpless, the more hopeless you become. This is a downward spiral that can be extremely dangerous. And so when we think about taking back control financially, it might be as simple as, I've got to go figure out how I'm going to get a better paying job. Or in my career, if we're white collar, career minded people, yeah, I'm ready. I've got to move up. I need to get promoted. And if it's not happening at this company and I see this other company over there that's more aligned to my personal mission, and I can maybe get 10% or 30% or whatever the percentage in increase, I can change my financial adversity. Yeah, I'm doing that. It might look like that. It's not always as simple as that, because sometimes, again, adversities stack on each other. So you might be strapped to be able to make such a move. And some of what I'm describing sounds very privileged. So it's about taking each piece of these adversities and trying to uncover them through the ways that you can to get really clear on then what are the areas you can take back? What control do you have? And then how do you empower yourself with this optimistic and growth mindset to say, I want to do something about that.
And I completely agree. I mean, from the very start of the book, you made it clear that in order to start working on ourselves, we have to figure out who we are, what our values are, what our passion is, what drives us to think the way we do or to behave in the certain way that we do. And you can't figure out how to tackle a situation in the best way possible only until you figure out what type of person you are. And I think this is very relatable, especially in teens, to how we've talked about the digital world and how we're hyper-connected today, and how teenagers, especially, I'm talking specifically now perhaps about high school students moving in, transitioning to their second stage of life when they go to university and later on have to figure out what career they're taking. it can be very challenging for them to actually find out what their mission is, what they want to do in life. And I think your book is really accessible, and it's a starting point that lays a very heavy foundation on what you can do to find who you are. And I want to take you now into the path of energies, because you've mentioned that they're very important and often overlooked. I mean, as soon as I open the book, I can say from my own experience, I was more drawn to the reality and the adversity rather than energy, which is something that I'm really interested about. But I just thought when I tackle myself in my life, that comes second. But actually, you challenge that. And you're covering the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual side of well-being. My question now for you, Nathan, is in a world full of burnout and constant busyness, how can we better regulate and recover our energy?
Yeah, there's no, well, good news and bad news is there's no one size fits all answer to that question. Sonia, you recognize, you hit something earlier about, starting our careers, transitioning into secondary education and moving into professional life as part of getting to know yourself. And then part of getting to know yourself is how you manage your energy and where you get your energy from and what drains your energy. So there's a couple of pieces that I think we should talk about. We can talk about the energy here in just a second, but getting to know yourself is really in the chapter about authenticity. And I always start with values. And by the way, it's not just young folks who are struggling to figure out, how they're going to get after all the things that they have in their life. In fact, many and most of my clients who I'm working with this year and part of last year too, never had the conversation with themselves about what their core values are. They had maybe visited it or experienced it in their early life, but as they went on into their careers, checking in with their core values and their core beliefs has been eye-opening for so many of them. Think, oh my gosh, yeah, you're totally right. I forgot that compassion and empathy or curiosity or learning are such a big part of who I am. And I should put those back out there because those are the things that actually fuel up my energy. So in this way, energy and authenticity, particularly around values and strengths, is really, really important to understand. The question you're talking about is specifically to understanding our well-being batteries. We have 4 key batteries or battery packs that enable us to show up as humans. That's our physical battery, which is about how we manage sleep and food and water and exercise, the real obvious things that people talk about these days, and self-care. People talk about self-care a lot. They're talking about the physical side of well-being and their physical well-being. We talk a little bit about emotional well-being, and I'm loving the fact that open discussions about open therapy and going to psychologists and seeking coaching is becoming more and more open. That's what we're talking about, is about talking about our emotional selves and our emotional health. But the other 2 batteries are less talked about and less frequently visited as areas of consideration for our well-being. And that is our mental well-being and our mental battery. And our mental well-being is really about how our brains are these magnificent processing units. I talk a little bit about the brain in a real simple way. Left hemisphere, right hemisphere, and we got the prefrontal cortex. And, it's like so important that our brains are considered in well-being because they're managing all this information. And it's in our mental energy that we manage how we organize our day, how we organize our time, how we think about time, how we actually plan things for today, and how it's unique also as a species that we can actually be clear about how we plan for the future, but also in the mental capacity of our brain is also how we have this unique thing as a species. These are the 2 unique things as humans, that we have this thing to resonate on the past and dwell on the past because of the way our brains are wired to hold memory. And so all of this processing is happening all the time. And so when people say, I'm just mentally exhausted, well, it's because your brain has been in hyperdrive, and we're not talking about ways and interventions that we can give our brains a break. And social media and the ways that we interact in the hyper connected world that you talked about has only put a much bigger strain on our ability to facilitate movement and thought and all the activity in our brain. It's almost near impossible. But we haven't yet figured out how to tap into all of the spaces in our brain yet as humans either. So there's probably more potential there for us to live in the information age and be able to process all that. But mental energy and our mental battery is a really important thing. In addition to your spiritual battery, which is the one, some people say this is really related to like a higher power or belief in God or an organized religion. But I often say that the spiritual battery is the relationship that you have with yourself and your purpose. So going back to then connecting the dots to your purpose comes from your values and your strengths and your belief and that core mission. And when you are tuned into that, you can supercharge your spiritual battery. And often the spiritual battery, which is where you live a meaningful life and purposeful driven life, that energy can be the supercharger of all the other batteries when they're down. But when one battery is down, it's likely some of those other batteries are also down or they're up, and it can create differences in mood and differences in temperament. And so being aware of the four batteries is the first step. But I would tell you that to answer the question, the second part is really about how do you get clear on what charges them up. You know, some people love to exercise. And when they exercise, they get the same endorphin high from all the hormones. That helps supercharge and reset the other batteries. But not everybody loves to exercise, you know? So
Yeah.
right. And sometimes exercise can really drain people because it's stressful. And I'm like, I don't want to do it. And I don't have time to do it. And it hurts. And no. They find different ways and different outlets to recharge their four battery pack. And so when you also know what charges you up and what drains you, and I talk about this in the book, I do it a lot with clients as we do a energy audit. You audit how you're spending time. And this was an unlock for me when I was going through therapy. I didn't realize how much time I was putting towards energy negative activities. Energy negative activities are activities that drain my soul, and those are really different than energy positive activities. Like doing a podcast with you, talking about my book, talking and sharing this information is energy positive. But if I have to work on a spreadsheet in my business and figure out what the numbers are and think about how I'm going to develop more, sales, like, oh God, that is energy negative. So it's about knowing those things. And when I figured that out, I was like, I was spending way too much time doing energy negative things. And that was not fueling my purpose. And it wasn't also enabling me to enjoy the work that I'm doing. So energy is a big part of it, but knowing who you are is a massive part of it too.
And I really love that you touched upon how we as species, as a human species, are generally acceptable to be actually talked about as the only one that can reminisce the past and plan for the future, and that we actually don't spend that much time being present. And there was this recent statistic that I came across that really absolutely shocked me, is that we spend over 10% of our brain activity comparing ourselves to others. And since 2.5 hours of social media is the average for an individual scrolling, and that's a lot of time comparing ourselves with other people on a daily basis. And I was really looking over here, skimming the book, to the 4-step method that you just talked about when your energy is high but your feelings are low. I just found it here. It's page 97. You talked about it as the energy matrix by Lohr and Schwartz, which is the 4 quadrants where high and low physical energies can intersect with positive and negative emotional energy. And I think one way to simplify for the listener for all of the information that they just sank in could be if you could give me practical tips that you perhaps do to help regulate these energy levels. You've mentioned that some of your clients prefer Sudoku or reading or binge watching TVs to help recharge their energies. Or perhaps if you're not really interested in running on a treadmill for 30 minutes, you prefer yoga or something more calming. What are some of your go-to relaxing and recharging activities that you do?
Yeah, I appreciate you pulling out the Lohr and Schwartz model. I've adapted that for my book. I love their book. It was an amazing book called The Power of Full Engagement, and I highly recommend people to read that book as well. It was a great place of some source material and inspiration for me, and has helped me in my coaching practice too. I talk about this, and I've adapted their matrix in the book, which is, when you, and we were just talking about sometimes the batteries that you have are related. Just to explain it a little bit more clearly, if your physical battery is super, super high charged and you're feeling great, you've exercised, you've had good nutrition, you've hydrated well, and your emotional energy is also feeling positive in that moment, well, then you're going to feel like real clear cheerfulness. You're going to feel more resilient. You're going to feel more powerful. You're going to feel more optimistic. You're going to feel more joyful. But if your physical battery is just on empty and you haven't slept in 3 days because you're doing exams, or you've got a massive project that you had to turn, to get through at work, and, it's like now it's the weekend and you don't know what to do. You're sitting on the couch, and your mom was, not your mom, but your mom is yelling at you to do, hey, you got to do laundry. When are you going to go to work? And you're like physically and then emotionally like struggling because you're just kind of down and tired. Well, then guess what? You're going to have feelings of despondency. You're going to not feel as happy. You're going to feel more depleted. And so understanding the relationship between these things is really key. Where you're talking about the second part of your question, mental energy. If your mental energy is supercharged, that battery of mental energy is highly charged up, you're going to feel sharp. Words are going to come fluidly. You're going to be smooth. Your brain is processing. It's a well-oiled machine. You can multitask, which I don't recommend, but people do. And people talk about multiple priorities. That's a misnomer because you can only have one. That's what the word priority means, but when you're supercharged, your mental battery, you're able to really feel clear. But if your mental battery and that mental energy is on a low, you're going to feel sluggish, and that's going to show up in your body, and your brain isn't going to be as sharp, and you're not going to know how to, do simple math, for example. That's how it shows up for me. And like, when I'm mentally drained, I can't process my emotions. My emotions become and this is how mental and emotional energy are connected. Okay. When I'm extremely exhausted mentally, I get more sentimental, and I get more teary eyed, and I get more down in a sense that I'm not strong and I'm suffering because my mental, capacity is at a diminished level of battery charge. Right. And therefore, knowing that if I take a walk, now that's a physical thing, but if I go for a walk on the street or down to the park in nature, that's a mental and spiritual thing for me too. So I'm able to use physical, mental, and spiritual energy to help charge and recharge my battery. But like you said, some people find, and my mom and dad are a great example. Every morning, the way they charge up their mental battery is they do the Wordle and they do the waffle puzzles, and they kind of sit on opposite couches while they have a morning coffee, doing their mental stimulation while they kind of charge up their bodies, and they're having a cup of coffee while they're physically charging up their bodies. So it's different for everybody. And the point of what we're talking about is you got to figure that out. Because if you never figure out how to charge up any of your batteries, then you're going to be empty. And in order to live a life of well-being and joy, you've got to be able to supercharge your batteries. And if we talked about activism, in order to be an amazing activist or an advocate, to go seek change in the world and to make some shit happen, to make things better and progress. Well, it is the same thing as that they say on all those airplanes, fill up, put on your own oxygen mask before you help others. Well, if you want to be an amazing activist or an amazing advocate and go make change in the world and have an amazing life, have an amazing career, amazing family, if you want to have all those things, guess what? You have to put that into yourself first. And there's kind of no escape to being selfish in this way. And there's a difference between being selfish and selfish. Putting yourself first in this way to supercharge your batteries and making sure that you can fill up your own well-being tank is going to make you be able to go farther, longer, and it's going to be able to enable you to live in that spiritual, purposeful way that we've been talking about. Failure to do that will end up likely causing harder things, more adversities, and more struggles. So understanding if it's Sudoku Cool. If it's binge watching Netflix, that's one of my things. And by the way, I love true crime stories because it enables my brain to think in a different way
Mm-hmm.
while I'm watching. It gives my brain a break from my other stuff, and it enables my brain to like try to figure out and solve like who got killed and why did they kill him and what was the motive. And like for me, that's a charge up, but that might not work for other people. So it's about how you, my husband will tell you, how many episodes of Law and Order do we have to watch? But, like it's about this way of understanding, exploring, and also for young people who are just kind of getting started in living your life fully because you're starting to live on your own and you're embracing those things. Go out and experiment. Try
Mm-hmm.
some different stuff. And if it works and your body will tell you like, yeah, that was good. And that your hormones and your physical body will indicate, yeah, that's working. If you go out and experiment and it doesn't feel doesn't feel right or is a miss or like going out for drinks after work or after school doesn't charge you up, that also might be a big hint that doesn't work. So identifying energy positive and energy negative and how they associate with your values is a huge part of the formula. That's a long answer. Sorry, but I hope we covered it all.
We did absolutely. And actually, I was thinking about my next question, which we're leaning on to here, the two tradition questions here on the Smarter podcast.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you, but I wanted to find the quote that you've mentioned from Brene Brown in your book on, I think it was vulnerability, because you place a huge importance on it. And so I'm really interested to the following question, what your answer will be, which is this. I'm passionate about books. I've also talked about this before the recording. What would you say, Nathan, would be your top two books that completely transform the way you view life or your perspective through which you tackle it? I'm putting you on the pedestal here.
No, you're putting me on the spot. It's not a pedestal. There's so many books that inspired me along the way. I'm generally a nonfiction reader. And so
Too.
yeah, I just love learning from other people and other people's life stories. As I mentioned earlier, the book that we mentioned, the Powerful Engagement, that was a really powerful book. Carol Dweck's book on mindset, a fascinating and really important read for people as you get to know how our brains work. There's a long list actually of books that are cited in my book as source material, but also for further reading and engagement to learn more. And I would recommend any of those. There's some really fascinating books out there today that I'm picked up. And I like biographies a lot. The current book I've got in my hands is Pete Buttigieg's book, Truth, which is his life story. And if the listeners don't know who Pete Buttigieg is, he was the first openly LGBTQ campaigner to run for the presidential office here in the United States. He's a fantastic communicator. And has had such an interesting life. I mean, reading is like a free ticket to visit so many places. Yeah, we could probably talk for a whole nother podcast on books, but I'll keep it there for now.
Yeah, and I do love your pick about Carol Dweck's mindset book, because I think it ties in really beautifully to what you're talking about and the subjects that you cover here in your real life. And then the last question from the tradition side is where I ask my last guest to leave a question for the next one. And so here's the question for my previous guest. You talk a lot about leading with empathy and purpose. What's one moment in your life, either personal or professional, that redefined what success means to you, and how has that shaped the way that you lead others today?
A little bit about this in the book. I was living in Tokyo, Japan in March of 2011 when the great northeastern earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster happened. And while we weren't at the epicenter or even close to the area, I lived the first time in Japan in that area, very specifically in Miyagi Prefecture, and was very close to people who lived in Keisanuma and the eastern coast and knew people who were affected by that earthquake, tsunami, and the Fukushima disasters. But I will tell you that the opportunity in the leadership space was really in the moments that followed. And You mentioned Brene Brown and being vulnerable and being open. And I didn't write a lot about vulnerability in my book because Brene Brown has written so much about it.
Yeah, yeah.
But in the moments of disaster and in that moment, I really needed to look and step up. And actually, that was my Advertenity too. I could have said, I'm so scared the world is ending and there's a nuclear disaster and we're all going to, be consumed. And many foreigners who were living in Japan at the time also decided to leave. I decided to stay because I saw that as an Advertenity, and I saw that in my own vulnerability of being scared and fearful of what was to come, even though it was very unknown, that people were looking to me and my colleagues in leadership to lead. And I just got chills. Leadership comes in those moments when you're willing to stand in dark or hard places and go first and be a pioneer, and not just a pioneer to lead people to a place, but to bring them to safety. And in this case, it was all about that security and about that safety. And we made it through, and the world didn't melt. I mean, yes, Japan did shift, and yes, the world tilted off its axis a little bit. And there's science in the book that talks about that too. But we're all still here. And I think it was in that moment that I recognized that actually my leadership has a sense of fearlessness, but it was also part of the reason why I was able to take back control, learn from the time that I lived in New York during 9/11, learn from those other kind of experiences and how to step up and how to lead and lead people to safety or to security or to, growth for themselves. And I think that's a magical question and a powerful one. I don't often get a chance to think about that. So I appreciate the question.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's doing the bold thing and the scary thing sometimes that a lot of people might be too hesitant as towards taking, or taking that leap of faith into the unknown and sticking out for yourself and I'm going to relate this to, let's say, if you're an entrepreneur and you've got an idea that you really think works and no one else supports you, that even in the dark or when people don't believe you, if you truly know what you want and how you want to do it and achieve it, then 9 times out of 10, you will succeed in doing it. So I started the podcast with you talking directly with the listener. I want to end it in the same way. So Nathan, if you have any parting idea or an advice or a habit that you want to leave the listener with, what would it be?
Yeah, I made the promise at the beginning that we would talk a little bit about leading your life with love. And all the things that we've talked about today around how you move through reality, releasing yourself, accepting yourself, getting to know yourself through the mechanisms of authenticity, and how you manage your energy all contribute to how you lead your life with love. And when you use those first 3, it's often the case that love is the outcome and the byproduct of those. Sometimes we start with love and it's about the self-care. And we didn't get a chance to talk about the trifecta of self-love, but self-care, self-compassion, and self-advocacy. Those show up through all the tools that we've talked about. And when you combine those things and you lead yourself with love, putting yourself in a position to charge yourself fully up so you can show up powerfully for yourself first, then you can really be powerful and authentically dynamic in the ways that you are as your unique self. Only you have the things that you bring. That's when you actually get to well-being and joy. And so it really is a start of the beginning and a beginning to the start, if that makes sense, that if you start with love, you get more love. And if you lead with love, you're charged up in the same ways that enable you to live a life of well-being. I know that sounds confusing, but if you read your book, read my book, Your Real Life, you're going to learn more about that. And I'm always happy to connect with your listeners if they want to do more of this work one-to-one or even in small groups. I'd love to connect and be part of everyone's journey in that way. Thank you for having me. And thanks for the opportunity to speak to you, a fellow bookworm and lover of books, but also to your audience. It's been such a great chance to think about some of my own stories in this way.
I agree, and I love your end message there. I think it's very motivational, empowering, and just heartfelt. It goes straight to the heart. Love to love. And I mean, you've definitely left a mark on me, so I'm gonna go ahead and say that definitely at least one person that tuned in today, that listened to this podcast, has in some way, shape, or form been impacted by what you said, and will go ahead and take those steps following the real model and perhaps become a better human being and love what they do in more full. Thank you, Nathan Andrews, for being on the Smarter podcast. It was my pleasure.
Thank you, Sonia. Take care.
You too. All right, and as moving forward, though Nathan didn't specifically mention 2 books that completely changed his life, as he mentioned in the podcast, he has 2 that are very predominant in his book, and a lot of them that are featured in it. But he mentioned precisely Carol Dweck's Mindset, which is linked down below if you want to get your hands on a potentially life-changing read that is an eye-opener. My personal addition to that would be his actual book, Your Real Life, because it's such a beautifully paved out blueprint of how you can start you yourself incorporating mindfulness, whether it's in terms of energy or really finding out our true roots in the terms of neuroscience and why we think the way that we think and how the world ticks in the ways that it does. I wanted to just make sure as a call to action to pick up on what Nathan said, that if any one of you is interested in whether individual or in a group session in Nathan's coaching, then make sure to see the links down below. If you've learned anything new today, which I've definitely had, whether it's about your real framework or how to tackle those hardships that come your way, make sure to rate this podcast 5 stars so we can keep bringing quality content to you and bringing the guests that you love on the show. And then lastly, as always, I just wanted to be the first to tell you that I believe in you and your ability to create the life of your dreams. Okay, bye-bye now. See you next week.